Hiroshima vanishes in a single flash of light. But in Tokyo, the Japanese High Command refuses to believe it. One general calls it impossible physics. Another insists the Americans are bluffing with conventional bombs. A third, a scientist who understands atomic theory, looks at the evidence and speaks the words that silence the room. What did they say? General Korochika Anami, the war minister, reportedly insisted the Americans had only one bomb. He called it American propaganda, a trick designed to frighten Japan into surrender. But physicist Yoshio Nishina, Japan's leading nuclear scientist, delivered a very different verdict. After examining the ruins of Hiroshima, he confirmed in a trembling voice, "It can only be an atomic bomb to cause such havoc. We scientists must apologize to the nation for our incompetence." And Emperor Hirohito, breaking centuries of imperial tradition, spoke words that would end the war. "We must bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable." These words changed everything. They determined the fate of millions. The men who had led Japan had to accept that their city was actually gone, and the acceptance did not come easily. August 6, 1945, morning. Hiroshima goes silent, completely gone from all communication. Japanese High Command sits in Tokyo. They received the first reports. Something happened in Hiroshima, but Tokyo had no reliable information yet. They would never imagine that what they were about to discover will be more terrifying than any battle they have ever seen. At precisely 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a uranium bomb called Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above Hiroshima. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at ground level exceeded 7,000 degrees Celsius, over 12,600 degrees Fahrenheit, in less than a second. Bronze statues melted, roof tiles fused together. Human beings were vaporized instantly, leaving only shadows burned into concrete walls. At least 70,000 people died in that single moment. But in Tokyo, 500 miles to the northeast, nobody knew any of this yet. The morning had begun like any other wartime day. Officers reported for duty, clerks filed paperwork. The machinery of the Japanese military continued its grinding routine. The first sign that something was wrong came just 1 minute after the explosion. At 8:16 a.m., a control operator at the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation noticed that the Hiroshima station had gone suddenly offline. This was unusual, but not immediately alarming. The operator tried to reconnect using another telephone line. That line was also dead. He tried a third line. Nothing. The operator may have felt a flicker of concern now. 1 dead line was a malfunction. 3 dead lines was something else. He likely reported the problem to his superiors and continued attempting to restore contact. About 20 minutes later, the Tokyo Railway Telegraph Center made a troubling discovery of its own. The mainline telegraph had stopped working just north of Hiroshima. Messages that should have been flowing smoothly between Tokyo and the western regions of Japan were simply not arriving, as if someone had cut a vital artery in Japan's communication network. Then the reports started coming in. From small railway stops within 10 miles of Hiroshima, confused and frightened operators were sending fragmentary messages. Something terrible had happened. There had been an explosion. A big one, bigger than anything that had ever been seen. But the details were contradictory, impossible to verify. Some said the city was burning. Others said there was no city left at all. How could both be true? These reports were transmitted to the headquarters of the Japanese General Staff in Tokyo. The officers who received them must have exchanged worried glances. Military headquarters repeatedly tried to call the Army control station in Hiroshima. The complete silence from the city puzzled the headquarters. They knew that no large enemy raid had occurred. Their early warning radar systems had detected only 2 or 3 aircraft approaching Hiroshima that morning, not the hundreds of bombers that would be needed for a major attack. They also knew that no sizable store of explosives was kept in Hiroshima at that time. There was no ammunition depot that could have accidentally detonated, no fuel storage facility that could have caught fire. So what happened? The word that kept appearing in these early reports was troubling. A flash. Witness after witness described a blinding white flash that lit up the entire sky, a flash brighter than the sun, then nothing, just smoke and fire. Some reports mentioned a strange cloud shaped like a mushroom, rising higher and higher into the sky. High Command did not know which reports to believe. The information was fragmented, confused, and often contradictory. They needed reliable intelligence. They needed someone they could trust to go to Hiroshima, see what had happened with their own eyes, and report back with accurate information. The decision was made. A young officer of the Japanese General Staff was instructed to fly immediately to Hiroshima. His orders were simple and direct. Land at the city, survey the damage, and return to Tokyo with reliable information for the staff. It was generally felt at headquarters that nothing too serious had taken place. The explosion was probably a rumor, starting from a few sparks of truth. Perhaps a conventional bomb had hit a factory, or there had been an industrial accident. The staff officers would sort things out. He would land in Hiroshima, find out what had really happened, and everyone could stop worrying. The officer went to the airport and boarded his aircraft. The engines roared to life. The plane lifted off and turned southwest toward Hiroshima, toward what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. He had no idea that he was flying toward hell itself. The staff officer flew southwest for about 3 hours. His aircraft droned steadily through the summer sky, carrying him closer and closer to a destination he could not yet imagine. For most of that journey, there was likely nothing unusual to see but the familiar landscape of Japan at war for years. Perhaps the officer reviewed his orders, made mental notes about what information he would need to gather, and planned his approach to the damaged city. The war had been going badly for Japan. American bombers had devastated city after city with conventional weapons. Tokyo had been firebombed, with tens of thousands killed in a single night. The officer had probably seen destruction before. He simply thought he knew what to expect. But he was wrong. While still nearly 100 miles from Hiroshima, he and his pilot saw something that must have stopped their breath. A great cloud of smoke rising from the horizon. Not the kind of smoke from a factory fire, or even a burning neighborhood. This was something entirely different. A column so massive, so tall, that it seemed to pierce the very heavens. It spread at the top, like an enormous mushroom, exactly as the fragmentary reports had described. The pilot may have said something. Perhaps they simply stared in silence, unable to process what they were seeing. This cloud was visible from 100 miles away. What kind of explosion could produce such a thing? They flew on, drawn forward by duty and by a terrible curiosity. The cloud grew larger as they approached. The smoke grew thicker, and then finally, after flying for about 3 hours total, the aircraft reached what had been Hiroshima. They circled the area in disbelief. The historical record described what they saw in stark terms. A great scar on the land, still burning and covered by a heavy cloud of smoke. That was all that was left of a great city. Where nearly 300,000 people had lived that morning, there was now flatness. Where streets had run in orderly patterns, there was rubble. Where the headquarters of the Second Army had stood, where factories and homes and schools and temples had filled a living city, there was now only destruction spreading in all directions. Bridges collapsed into rivers that were choked with bodies. Buildings that stood for generations were simply gone, reduced to ashes and twisted metal. Fires still burned in places, sending new columns of smoke into the already darkened sky. From the air, the destruction must have seemed almost abstract, almost unreal. A dark circle of devastation surrounded by the green of the countryside. A wound on the face of Japan. They landed south of the city, in an area that had escaped the worst of the devastation. The staff officer immediately reports to Tokyo and organizes relief measures. The exact words he sent back to headquarters were lost to history. But the meaning was clear. The city was gone. Those 4 words, or words very much like them, traveled back to Tokyo by radio. In the headquarters of the Japanese General Staff, the generals had to face a terrifying new reality. One of Japan's major cities had been erased from the map in a single morning. But even with this eyewitness confirmation, Tokyo still did not fully understand what had happened. The answers would come from two sources. The first was from the White House, 16 hours after the bombing. President Truman declared that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, a weapon harnessing the fundamental power of the universe. The second source was a Japanese scientist who understood atomic physics better than anyone in his country. His name was Yoshio Nishina, and what he discovered in Hiroshima would change everything. Yoshio Nishina was not an ordinary man. Born in 1890 in a small village near Okayama, Nishina had shown extraordinary intellectual gifts from an early age. He graduated at the top of his class from Tokyo Imperial University, receiving a silver watch from the emperor himself. In Copenhagen, he worked with Niels Bohr, one of the pioneers of quantum theory and atomic physics. The two men became good friends, united by their passion for understanding the secrets of the atom. In 1928, Nishina and physicist Oscar Klein published a groundbreaking paper that led to the Klein-Nishina formula, a fundamental equation in quantum physics that is still used today. When Nishina returned to Japan in late 1928, he brought with him the knowledge of atomic physics that would make him his country's most important nuclear scientist. He built Japan's first cyclotrons, particle accelerators that could probe the secrets of the atom. He mentored a generation of young physicists, including two who would later win Nobel Prizes. And in 1941, when Japan went to war with America, Nishina was asked to lead his country's effort to build an atomic bomb. The project was codenamed NIGO, after the first syllable of Nishina's name. For 4 years, Nishina and his team worked to develop a nuclear weapon for Japan, but they faced insurmountable obstacles. Japan lacked sufficient uranium. It lacked the industrial capacity to produce enriched fissile material. The project never came close to success. Nishina himself had estimated that even the United States, with all its vast resources, would struggle to produce an atomic bomb within a few years. In this, he had been terribly wrong. On August 7th, the day after the bombing, Nishina received a copy of a restricted press release about the bomb that had come from President Truman. The Americans were claiming they had used an atomic weapon on Hiroshima, a bomb that harnessed the power of splitting atoms. Nishina understood immediately what this meant. If it were true, it would change everything. On August 8th, he led a team of approximately 30 scientists, army doctors, and engineers to Hiroshima. They traveled under the command of Army Lieutenant General Saizo Arasu. Their mission was to determine with scientific certainty what kind of weapon had destroyed the city. As their aircraft approached Hiroshima, Nishina looked down at the scorched desert below. According to historical accounts, he felt sure from the first glimpse that it was the work of a nuclear bomb. The pattern of destruction, the reports of the blinding flash, the unprecedented scale of devastation, all of it pointed to one conclusion. But Nishina was a scientist. He needed evidence. He needed data. He needed proof that would satisfy the standards of scientific inquiry. The team landed and began their investigation. They faced a city of horrors beyond anything they had imagined. Survivors with terrible burns wandered through the ruins, their skin hanging in strips from their bodies. The dead lay everywhere, in the streets, in the rivers, in the ruins of their home. Many of the corpses showed no visible wounds. They had been killed not by heat or blast, but by the invisible force of radiation. The investigation team conducted autopsies on those who had died without apparent external injuries. What they found inside those bodies was disturbing evidence of atomic destruction. The stomachs, according to one account, looked as though they had been scoured with a wire brush. Every small passage of the internal organs were clogged with blood. This was not the damage you would see from a conventional explosion. This was cellular destruction, the signature of intense radiation. Nishina had proof that he needed. On August 10th, the investigation teams, the scientists, the army teams, and the naval team from Kure Naval Base met to compare their findings. The resulting telegraphed reports of the Central Military Command was definitive. This bomb was neither dynamite nor an incendiary weapon. It has been clearly identified as an atomic bomb. There was no longer any more room for doubt. Nishina came to the office of Secretary to the Cabinet Sakomizu and spoke in a tremulous voice. His words carried the weight of terrible knowledge, of scientific certainty that meant doom for his nation. It can only be an atomic bomb to cause such havoc. We scientists must apologize to the nation for our incompetence. It was an extraordinary admission. Japan's leading physicist was acknowledging not only that America had built the weapon first, but also that Japan's own scientists had failed in the most important race of the war. Premier Suzuki, when he heard the confirmation, understood the implications immediately. He declared, "This is not a defeat of the Japanese armed forces at the hands of U.S. forces, but rather the defeat of Japanese science and technology by U.S. technology. Therefore, the military should not speak of prestige." If America had atomic bombs, they could destroy every major city in Japan: Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Nagoya. No way to stop the bombers or to shoot down the weapon before it detonated. The age of conventional warfare was over. The atomic age had begun. But not everyone was ready to accept this reality. One man in particular refused to believe that the war was lost. His name was Korochika Anami, and he was the most powerful military voice in Japan. General Anami, a man of iron will and unshakable conviction. Born in 1887 in Takeda, a small city in Oita Prefecture, he dedicated his entire life to serving the emperor and the Japanese Empire. He had entered the Imperial Japanese Army Academy as a young man and risen steadily through the ranks, driven by talent, determination, and an absolute commitment to the warrior code of Bushido. From 1929 to 1930, he had served as aide-de-camp to Emperor Hirohito himself. In April 1945, he was appointed war minister in the cabinet of Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki. It was a position of enormous responsibility. As war minister, Anami spoke for the entire Japanese army. His voice carried weight in every discussion about the future of the war. And Anami's position was clear, unwavering, and absolute. Japan must not surrender. Even before Hiroshima, Anami had been advocating for Ketsogo, Operation Decisive, the plan for a final apocalyptic battle on the Japanese home islands. The concept was terrible in its logic. When the Americans invaded, Japan would throw everything into the defense. Civilians would be armed with bamboo spears and taught to fight to the death. The casualties on both sides would be astronomical, and better to die fighting than live in disgrace. These words, or words very much like them, may have been spoken in countless meetings as Anami argued his case. When the first reports of Hiroshima reached Tokyo, Anami's reaction was immediate and emphatic. He declared almost immediately after learning of the bombing, "I'm convinced that the Americans had only one bomb after all." This statement reveals the desperate logic of a man searching for any reason to continue the fight. If America had only one atomic bomb, then Hiroshima was a tragedy, but not a strategic defeat. Japan had already lost dozens of cities to conventional firebombing. Even one destroyed by this new weapon did not have to mean the end. In the meeting that followed Hiroshima, Anami held firm to his position. The Supreme Council for the direction of the war, the Big Six who controlled Japan's fate, found themselves deadlocked. 3 members wanted to accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition: preservation of the imperial institution. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai believed that Japan had no choice but to surrender. The war was lost. Further resistance would only increase the suffering. 3 others, including Anami, wanted additional terms. They proposed that Japan should disarm its own forces rather than submit to foreign disarmament. They wanted Japan to conduct its own war crimes trials rather than submit its soldiers to foreign justice. Most importantly, they wanted no occupation of Japanese soil, a condition that would preserve Japan's sovereignty and the emperor's position. These additional demands were conditions the Allies would never accept. After years of brutal warfare, after Pearl Harbor and Bataan, and thousands of other battles, America and its allies would never permit Japan to dictate the terms of peace. But the Big Six could only act when unanimous, 3 against 3. Under the Japanese governing system, this deadlock was unbreakable. while the leaders debated in Tokyo, somewhere in the Pacific, on the island of Tainan. Another aircraft was being prepared for another mission. Another bomb was being loaded into another B-29. On August 9th, just 3 days after Hiroshima, the second atomic bomb fell, and all of Anami's arguments about only one bomb were reduced to ashes. The bomb that fell on Nagasaki was different from Little Boy. This weapon, nicknamed Fat Man, was a plutonium implosion device, technically more sophisticated and more powerful than the uranium bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. Its explosive yield was equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. The original target for August 9th was not Nagasaki, but Kokura, home to one of Japan's largest munitions plants. The mission had been moved forward from its original date of August 11th due to weather forecasts predicting poor conditions in the coming days. At 3:47 a.m. Tiananmen time, the B-29 bomber, Boxcar, lifted off with Fat Man in its bomb bay. Major Charles Sweeney was at the controls. The crew flew northwest toward Japan, toward what they believed would be the mission's primary target. When Boxcar arrived over Kokura, the city was obscured. Smoke and haze from fires started by a conventional bombing raid on nearby Yahata the day before had drifted over the target. The bombardier could not see well enough to drop the bomb accurately. Sweeney made 3 passes over Kokura, searching for a break in the smoke. Each pass burned precious fuel. Each pass gave Japanese anti-aircraft gunners more chances to find their range. After 50 minutes of fruitless attempts, with fuel running critically low, Sweeney made the decision to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., local time, Fat Man detonated over the industrial valley of Nagasaki, roughly midway between 2 major Mitsubishi manufacturing facilities. The bomb exploded with devastating force, killing between 40,000 and 75,000 people immediately. By the end of 1945, the death toll would reach approximately 80,000. The Big Six were still debating how to respond to Hiroshima when reports of Nagasaki arrived. The meeting may have fallen silent. The generals and ministers may have stared at each other in horror before they could reach any decision about the first bomb, as Second City had been destroyed. On the same day, August 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. After years of supposed neutrality, after Japan had hoped to use Stalin as a mediator for peace negotiations, the Soviets had turned against them. A massive Red Army force was pouring across the border, crushing Japanese resistance. Japan was now facing atomic annihilation from America and conventional invasion from Russia. The empire was collapsing from 2 different directions at once. For Anami and those who believed America had only one bomb, Nagasaki destroyed that hope completely and irrevocably. If America could use a second atomic bomb just 3 days after the first, it meant they had the capacity to produce these weapons. It meant there would be a third and a fourth, and every city in Japan could be a target until nothing remained but ashes and shadows. But even with 2 cities destroyed and the Soviets advancing through Manchuria, the Supreme Council remained deadlocked. Anami and his allies continued to insist on their additional conditions. The impasse could only be broken by one person, someone whose words were considered divine, whose authority came not from politics or military rank, but from the very gods themselves. For most of Japanese history, emperors had reigned but not ruled. Real power resided with shoguns, military governments, and councils of advisors who made decisions in the emperor's name. The emperor was a symbol, a living god, a presence above the messy business of actual governance. Emperor Hirohito had largely followed this tradition since ascending to the throne in 1926. He had approved the war, but he had rarely intervened directly in political or military decisions. He had rubber-stamped the decisions of his war council, including the decision to attack Pearl Harbor. He had remained aloof, divine, untouchable. But in August 1945, with his nation facing annihilation, with atomic fire consuming his cities and Soviet armies advancing through his empire, Hirohito did something unprecedented. He stepped down from his divine remoteness and intervened in the affairs of mortals. Late on the night of August 9th, Prime Minister Suzuki convened an emergency meeting. The full Supreme Council gathered in an underground conference room in the Imperial Palace, a bomb shelter beneath the ancient seat of Japanese power. The same arguments were made again. The same positions were staked out. The same deadlock persisted. 3 in favor of accepting the Potsdam Declaration with one condition, 3 demanding additional terms. Unanimous agreements were impossible, and without unanimity, the council could not act. Around 2 a.m. on August 10th, Prime Minister Suzuki did something extraordinary. He turned to Emperor Hirohito and asked him to decide between the 2 positions. This was almost without precedent in Japanese history. The emperor was not supposed to make such decisions. He was supposed to accept the unanimous recommendations of his advisors. But there was no unanimous recommendation. There was only deadlock, destruction, and the threat of annihilation. The room may have fallen absolutely silent. Every eye may have turned to the slight figure of the emperor. Hirohito spoke. The participants later recorded his words. The emperor stated that he had given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad. He had considered the condition of Japanese military forces. He had considered the suffering of his people. He had considered what would happen if the war continued. His conclusion was clear. Continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation and prolongation of bloodshed and cruelty in the world. Then he spoke the words that would echo throughout history, words that would be repeated in countless accounts of this moment. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The time has come to bear the unbearable. He announced his support for surrender, with only the condition that the imperial institution be preserved. No additional demands, no further conditions. For the men in that room, the emperor's words carried the weight of divine command. In Japanese tradition, the emperor was not merely a political leader. He was considered divine, a direct descendant of the sun god Amaterasu. When Hirohito spoke, it was the voice of heaven itself. The decision was made, the debate was over. General Anami bowed his head. He had argued passionately for continuing the fight. He had insisted that Japan could still resist, but he could not defy the emperor. No true Japanese soldier could. He was overruled by the voice of the divine. But Anami made one final statement before accepting defeat. The military had not lost, he said. Japan had not lost. They had been defeated by a weapon that threatened human existence itself. It was a subtle distinction, but an important one for Anami. Japan had not been conquered in honorable battle. Japan had been overwhelmed by a force of nature, a weapon so terrible that fighting against it was like fighting against the sun itself. On August 11th, Japan sent word to America through neutral Switzerland. They would accept the Potsdam Declaration if the emperor could remain. The American reply stated the emperor would be subordinate to the occupation commander, but he could remain. This produced another round of debate, another deadlock, and another imperial intervention. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito once again broke the deadlock, announcing that he was satisfied with the American terms. Japan would surrender. The war was over. But for General Anami, the story had one final chapter, one final act that would become a symbol of an era ending forever. August 14th, 1945. Evening. General Kurochika Anami sat in his official residence as darkness fell over Tokyo. The summer heat was oppressive, but perhaps Anami didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, contemplating matters far removed from physical comfort. Earlier that day, he had signed the surrender document with the rest of the cabinet. His signature was on the paper that would end the war he had fought so hard to continue. He had ordered his subordinates to obey the emperor's command. He had refused to join a coup d'etat that some junior officers were attempting in a desperate doomed bid to prevent the surrender and continue the war. The coup would fail. The emperor's recorded surrender announcement was safely hidden. Tomorrow at noon it would be broadcast across Japan. That evening, Anami's brother-in-law, Colonel Masahiko Takeshita, came to visit. According to historical accounts, Takeshita had been alerted by Anami's maid that the generals seemed to be making preparations for something significant. When Takeshita entered the room, Anami turned to him and spoke without emotion, his voice calm and steady. "I'm thinking of seppuku tonight." Takeshita's reply was measured. It doesn't have to be tonight, does it? Anami seemed relieved that his brother-in-law did not object to the act itself, only to its timing. He explained that he had chosen this particular night because it was the 14th anniversary of his father's death. He could not bear to live through the Emperor's surrender broadcast, scheduled for noon the following day. Around 2 a.m., sounds of gunfire echoed from a nearby palace grounds. The last gasps of the failed coup attempt. Anami showed no interest in joining the rebels. The path was not for him. He had made his choice. In the early hours of August 15th, Anami prepared himself in the traditional manner of a samurai. He dressed in his formal uniform. He wrote a farewell note, his handwriting steady and clear. The note has been preserved and is now displayed in a museum in Tokyo. It reads, "I, with my death, humbly apologize to the Emperor for the great crime." What was the great crime for which he was apologizing? Historians have debated this question for decades. Anami performed seppuku, the ritual suicide of samurai, cutting his abdomen with a ceremonial dagger, but the wound was not immediately fatal. For approximately 3 hours he lingered between life and death, his suffering witnessed by those who had come to him in his final moments. Finally, a staff officer could bear it no longer. He ordered a military physician to administer a lethal injection, ending Anami's agony. The sun rose over Tokyo on August 15, 1945. General Korochika Anami was dead. The last samurai had made his final choice. Anami's sword, his blood-stained dress uniform, and his suicide note are now displayed at Yushikan Museum in Tokyo, next to Yasukuni Shrine, where the spirits of Japan's war dead are honored. At noon that day, the Emperor's voice crackled across the radio waves, speaking to his people for the first time in history. The recording was scratchy, and the language formal and archaic. Emperor Hirohito spoke in a classical form of Japanese that many ordinary citizens struggled to understand. His voice was thin, strange, utterly unfamiliar. No Japanese citizen had ever heard their emperor speak. After the broadcast ended, an announcer had to clarify the message in simpler terms. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. The enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Hirohito said in his broadcast, "The power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives." To continue the war, he explained, would lead not only to the collapse of the Japanese nations, but also to the total extinction of human civilization. Then came the words that would define that moment, words that have been quoted countless times in the decades since. "We must bear the unbearable and endure the unendurable." Across Japan, people wept. Soldiers who had been prepared to fight to the death fell to their knees. Civilians who had been taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace struggled to comprehend that their divine emperor was telling them to accept defeat. Some could not accept it. In the days that followed, there were additional suicides, soldiers who refused to believe the empire had fallen. But for most of Japan, the war ended that day. The fighting stopped, the dying stopped. The unbearable had to be borne. On September 2, 1945, aboard the mighty battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials in formal dress signed the instrument of surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony as Japan formally admitted defeat. World War II was over. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki killed approximately 200,000 people by the end of 1945. Many more would die in the years that followed from radiation-related diseases. But the impact of the atomic bomb extended far beyond the death toll, far beyond the borders of Japan. For the first time in human history, humanity possessed the power to destroy itself entirely. A single weapon could erase a city. A handful of weapons could devastate a nation. A full-scale nuclear war could end civilization, and perhaps all human life. When the Japanese High Command finally understood what had happened to Hiroshima, they did not simply lose a battle. They didn't simply lose a war. They realized they were witnessing the beginning of a new age, an age where one bomb could end the world. Their responses to this terrifying reality were varied and deeply human. Anami clung first to the denial and then to honor, choosing death over surrender. Nishina faced the scientific reality with painful honesty, acknowledging the failure of Japanese science. Hirohito found the courage to speak words that had never been spoken by any Japanese emperor, to step down from divine remoteness and bear the unbearable alongside his people. All of them were caught in forces larger than themselves. The decisions made in those Tokyo war rooms were shaped by centuries of Japanese culture, by years of brutal warfare, by the desperate logic of a nation facing annihilation. The atomic bomb changed warfare, politics, and the entire future of humanity. The Cold War, the nuclear arms race, and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, all of these can trace their origins back to those August days in 1945. And it all started with the flash over Hiroshima, brighter than the sun itself. The light from that flash still illuminates our world today. The decisions made in those Tokyo war rooms still shape our present. And the words spoken by those men, words of denial, of acceptance, of unbearable truth, still echo across the decades. One bomb, one choice, everything changed. If you found this story of courage and tactical innovation compelling, please subscribe to our channel. We bring you more untold stories of the men and women who changed history through determination, innovation, and sacrifice. Hit the subscribe button and join us as we explore the remarkable true stories that shaped our world.